Happy Wednesday evening. Welcome to our 9th Silicon Slopes SMB Series Town Hall. Boy, we've had some great conversations. This is the 9th, and we have done our best to bring topics that would be helpful to the Utah small business community. We've talked about accessing PPP loans, understanding loan forgiveness. We've delved into some difficult conversations around mental and emotional health that inevitably emerge during times of crisis. We've talked about pivoting business strategy and pivoting operations to be successful in a moment like this. And I hope that you found these conversations helpful. This evening, I am excited to have a conversation with someone who's been a family friend and someone who's inspired me a lot since I knew him or met him growing up in Boston many years ago. Before I met Senator Romney, I remember a story that my dad told me when I was young about a time, an experience that he had in the mission. He was in the town of Nantes, France, with then Elder Romney. They'd gone back to their apartment. It was a cold, snowy evening. Someone knocked at the door, burst in, and said, "We've got a problem. We need some help." They raced out the door. In fact, Elder Romney raced out the door so fast on that snowy evening that he neglected to put shoes on. They got on their bikes and they went to help a couple of sister missionaries who were being hassled by a rugby team who just lost and were probably drowning their sorrows that evening. 20 ripped rugby players and a few trim Mormon missionaries. And I'm told they got right in the middle of the scrum. They did what they needed to do to defend these female missionaries. And let's just say it didn't end well. And I'm not talking about the rugby team. Apparently, it didn't end well. And I have to say, and I will give the senator an opportunity to clear up any facts that I've missed. But one of the things that I saw early on getting to know Senator Romney, and I've had the ability to work on 3 of his campaigns. I know multiple people who've worked closely with him in the business world, in the political world. And I will tell you, they will all say, this guy doesn't back down from a fight that he believes in. And you know what, Senator Romney, thank you for being here this evening. I hope the jaw has healed. How you feeling? Welcome.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's good to be with you. And that is a blast from the past. That's a true story. We ran down a hill from our apartment where your dad was the district leader and I was just a junior companion, not to him, but to another elder. We ran down the hill, about 6 of us, to try and defend some sister missionaries who were being hassled. And we got beaten up pretty bad. Your dad either lost a tooth or his tooth was broken in half. I don't remember which. My jaw got dislocated. We both went to the hospital the next day, but that night we all got picked up by a paddy wagon and taken to the police department, their police station. And our mission president convinced us not to bring charges against this team that had beaten us up. But not exactly what you expect from a mission. But my mission was pretty colorful in a number of dimensions, probably prepared me for my life in politics.
You know, it's either a great experience or a great story. We'll call it a great story looking back on that. I want to jump into some questions. This is a unique opportunity for us to get some perspective from someone who has not only been through a lot, but who has been behind the scenes in Washington during all of this. You know, there's nothing normal about 2020. And you can look all the way back earlier in the year outside of our country, the fires in Australia, the protests in Hong Kong, of course, COVID hits in China, and it comes here to the U.S. It's been an unimaginable year. And I'm not sure that anyone would have thought 4 months ago that we would lock down this country. What's it been like as a senator in Washington during this period?
Well, the key thing, of course, was at the very beginning of the crisis, as the country began to be locked down, as it was clear that a lot of jobs are going to be lost. The Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, met with all the Republican senators, and he said, if we do nothing, we'll probably see 20% unemployment and maybe a lot more. And there was a recognition that if we do nothing, we'll not only see a lot of unemployment, but a lot of businesses will go under. People will not be able to pay their rent. Therefore, landlords will go under. Therefore, the banks that own the notes to those landlords will begin to have trouble. We could have a financial meltdown. So it was a pretty severe setting, which he described to us. And we met with a Republican caucus in the Senate and with our Democrat friends across the hall, and talked about what should we do, what can we do on an immediate basis. And Mitch McConnell did something I haven't seen him do before. He divided our Republican caucus into different task forces, each responsible for a different area of the economy, meaning someone is responsible for unemployment, someone else is responsible for a stimulus payment, somebody else was looking at small business, someone else looking at large business. So we divided up, and then we met. First, we met just with Republicans to decide where we were. Then we brought in the Democrats, the counterparts, and these same task force assignments were made. We negotiated with each other, and within about 10 days, we passed legislation which resulted in about, well, several $1 trillion of funding and spending. Some through the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, some through the PPP program. I know your colleagues are familiar with a payment to individuals of $1,200 per person, and then a boost in unemployment insurance. It's interesting in a setting like this to move on a rapid basis without going through committees and the normal legislative process requires unanimous consent in the Senate. Getting 100 senators to agree to anything is almost impossible. And so, for instance, there were a couple of Democrats who insisted on the unemployment rate being raised by $600 a week. And Republicans said, that's crazy. People will be making more money by not working than they were by working. And yet, if you wanted to get the votes of all the senators, that's something you had to agree to. So we sort of swallowed hard, took action, and with the hope that we could keep the economy from going into a true tailspin that led not only to business closure on a permanent basis, massive unemployment, but also a collapse of our financial system, which would yield, of course, another doom loop of more bankruptcies and more unemployment. So it was encouraging to see people work together so well. And by the way, I should say this. Republicans and Democrats, despite what you hear in the press and what you may imagine, the way I imagined it, people get along really well. People quite collegial, quite friendly across the aisle when the cameras are off. When the cameras go on, it's battle because we're battling for who has control. But on a personal basis, it's really quite remarkably friendly and collaborative.
One of the things that we talk about in our business at Traeger is what have we learned since the crisis started? And for example, one of the things we've done so much better than ever is we communicate, and we ask ourselves, how do we take that improved communication, which is very deliberate, and carry it forward when life gets back to some reasonable normalcy? I was impressed as as someone watching from the outside in, how quickly you guys got money out to the country, and that was important. It's interesting to hear you say that politics is actually, when the cameras are off, it's friendly. Are there any learnings that happen? Are there conversations internally around, what do we take from this? Like that felt, I'll tell you, as a consumer of politics, it felt good to see alignment quickly. Is it naive to believe that there's something that can be taken when the cameras are on and we're out of crisis mode, that we can actually be more productive?
Yeah, the answer is no. It is one of the strange things about Washington is that if you are the party in power in Congress, in the House by a simple majority, in the Senate, traditionally it's required 60 votes, but the party that's in power has extraordinary power. The party in the Senate that's in power gets to have the chairpersons for all the committees and also gets to set the agenda. Mitch McConnell, for instance, can decide which bills we're going to vote on unilaterally. He can decide whether or not a bill which has been passed by the House and perhaps has gone through the committee in the Senate with full support, bipartisan support, he can decide whether it's ever going to get voted on. There are a few exceptions, but by and large, the party in power has enormous strength in setting the agenda and in moving forward legislation they care about. And what that means is that with the stakes so high, the fight, if you will, the battle to become the party in power is really quite intense. And you're seeing that right now with regards to a piece of legislation, excuse me, it's not the COVID, don't worry, a piece of legislation relating to police reform, which is that Republicans have a bill on police reform. It's about 70% the same as the Democrat bill. Republicans said, hey, let's take this up on the floor. We'll allow Democrats to make amendments to it if they'd like to, and we'll vote on each one. But let's put this on the floor and get started. And the Democrats said, no way. And I listened to Tim Scott today, the author or the lead author of the Republican bill, senator from South Carolina. He said, look, this was not a matter of Democrats saying they don't like what's in the bill. What they don't like is who wrote the bill. They don't like the fact that Republicans would get credit for helping do police reform. And they'd rather not have police reform than actually have Republicans get credit for it. Because we're getting close to an election in November, and there's no way we're going to give Republicans any wins whatsoever, particularly if it looks like kind of an outreach to a minority community. So I'm afraid to say that the politics haven't changed, and I think they're unlikely to change, just given the stakes associated with being in the majority.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back to the economy for a second. Having talked to a lot of business leaders and business owners early on, mid-late March, it was dominated by this tremendous uncertainty. And, it feels like we are in a better place than I might have guessed 3 months ago, and credit to, some swift action. With that said, we don't know how to plan the back half of this year in our business. Like we don't know what is real, what's stimulus. Unemployment is probably better than some might have expected, but it's still, it's the highest it's been since the Great Depression. Do you have a sense for where the macro economy is, and how do we get healthy again?
Well, I'll mention a couple things, caveats here before I make any projection. First of all, in the last 100 years, we've never experienced anything quite like this. So the normal economic forecasting tools really are ineffective. So we just don't know how the economy will respond to what's happening in COVID, to the lockdown, to the level of unemployment we have, because there's never been anything of this nature. Normally, if there's a recession, we can look at levels of inventory, we can look at purchasing levels, we can look at savings levels, and so we can predict off of a number of tools what's going to happen and when. But we really can't predict from COVID because one, we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know whether we're going to have a vaccine or not. So that's part one. Part two is something that Alan Greenspan said a long time ago. He said it's very difficult to project when a recession will end. He says, because in part, recessions are the result of irrational behavior. They're a result of people responding emotionally to negative signals and overreacting to them in many cases, and driving the economy into a deep hole that really shouldn't go into. And then there's a change in sentiment, and they, in many cases, overreact again and create irrational exuberance and drive things to a bigger high. So we got two problems here. One, we've never dealt with something like COVID-19 before in the economic projections. And number two, the economy or a recession like this is a result to a certain degree of irrational behavior. And then finally, I just note that what's going to happen to the economy depends very significantly on what's going to happen to COVID-19 and whether people become frightened again so that they don't want to get on airplanes. They don't want to go on vacations. They don't want to go to hotels. They don't want to go to restaurants. And the numbers we're seeing today suggest that there's going to be some fear again. Now, my own view is this, which is because the disease does not have a high mortality rate among young people, and I'm talking about people in their teens, their 20s, their 30s, 40s maybe, that younger people are going to go back to their life and they're going to go back to some restaurants and travel and entertainment. But older people are probably going to be more reticent and are going to hang back. So I expect that even as COVID continues to exceed the number of cases we were expecting at this point, I think the economy will come back moderately, but I have a hard time seeing it come back in full swing until older people and people with compromised immune systems feel safe. And at that point, the money from those that have saved a lot of money over their careers will come back into the market. But I don't see that anytime in the next couple of months.
You know, so the government assistance was obviously vital, and one of the things that we spent a lot of time on our economic impact committee talking and surveying small businesses here in Utah, and I developed a lot of empathy for these small business owners, especially those that are not venture funded. Their balance sheets are their checking accounts. And the PPP loan was a great short-term opportunity to sort of find bottom in their business and hopefully someday return to growth. It's short-term in nature, it was extended, and that was of course a great thing for these small businesses. But is there other legislation that you're working on that might provide, from when these PPP funds run out until when we get this moment of confidence where everyone's back in the economy? Are there things that the government that you're working on from a legislative perspective that could be helpful?
Well, I think the most helpful thing that people are talking about is, if you will, extending the PPP program and allowing small businesses to apply for another PPP loan. And in this circumstance, my expectation would be that if there is an extension to the PPP program and allowing, let's say, restaurants to apply for another round, that it would be more targeted than last time. Last time, individuals who took out a PPP loan had to say that their business couldn't survive without it. But this time, I think there'd be a more careful scrutiny, and it would only be available for businesses perhaps that saw a 20 or 30 or 40% decline in revenue. So for businesses that didn't see a decline or saw a very modest decline, they wouldn't be eligible for the next round of PPP loans. Now, I can't guarantee that's what it's going to look like. But as I listen to other Republicans talking about another round, they're saying it needs to be more targeted this time. The first time there was a sense of, hey, we need to get money out into the economy as fast as we can and keep doors open as opposed to just causing a complete collapse. And so there wasn't a lot of attention paid to all of the requirements to be able to get a PPP loan. This time, I think there'd be much more care and specificity as to who would qualify for it. So that is something which is being discussed. But I can tell you also that even among the Republican caucus, there are some who feel that no more spending is justified by the federal government, that at this stage, we've done as much as we can do and people are going to have to get along on their own. I'm not one of those. I would continue to provide support for small businesses and, by the way, if necessary, for large business. I note that businesses over 500 employees had the capacity to go to what we called our mainstream lending program, which was administered by the Treasury and the Fed. which was several $trillion of loan capacity. These loans don't get forgiven, however. They're market rate loans. And there has not been a lot of uptake on that. Even a company like Boeing, which we expected was going to need tens of billions of dollars from the federal government, it was able to get a market rate loan elsewhere for a better deal that they could get from the Treasury. So there is plenty of additional funding necessary for larger businesses at market rates. But for smaller businesses where the loans need to get forgiven, I think it'll be a more narrow focused relief package if one comes along at all. Now, by the way, states also want additional funding because they have a big revenue gap. Our state is one of the most fiscally solvent and stable states in the country. We've seen relatively little reduction in our revenue, and we have a large rainy day fund. So we're not in the same desperate situation as some other states, but some other states are in real trouble. So they're looking for some help and hoping that the federal government will write checks to help them with regards to the gap they have in their revenue. Then there's one more area that we'll probably be talking about, which is providing liability protection. Now, Utah's legislature has wisely moved on this front already, and saying that if someone got COVID-19 and they accuse a restaurant of being the place they got it and want to sue the restaurant, Utah is saying, no way, we're not going to allow that. The federal government wants to do the same thing. It wants to provide, we would like to provide a blanket coverage against COVID-19 lawsuits against businesses of all kinds, schools, hospitals, universities. We're afraid otherwise it'll be harder for them to open and get the economy going. And I should mention one more, and that is unemployment insurance. There are some that want to continue unemployment insurance beyond July 31st, but I can pretty much guarantee it will not have that $600 a week bonus on top of the regular unemployment insurance rate. Republicans just won't stand for doing that again.
Yeah, that is one of the areas that we hear from businesses is that in some cases the take home your compensation is more than you were making before. Why return to work when the federal government will pay you handsomely? One of the things that's I think germane to the state right now is that venture-backed tech and innovation has been such a growth engine for the state of Utah for the last 15 plus years. One thing that I hear as I talk to other investors in which I think we've seen in past recessions, there's often a flight to safety from an investment perspective. In some cases, you look at asset classes where the risk-adjusted return is simply better right now than in sort of early stage tech. A few years ago, there was some real estate tax incentives. These qualified opportunity zones were created. And I know there are a lot of opinions around how effective they were, but one thing they did is they stimulated investment in real estate. If you look at downtown Salt Lake City, heading east off of the 15 towards downtown, it clearly it's created investment. Is there a corollary in the venture space that may create some near-term stimulus to make sure that investment in innovation doesn't suffer during this period?
Well, that's a really good question, Jeremy, and one that is not being spoken about to any great extent in Washington at this point. Right now, Washington's agenda is coming up with the next version of the CARES Act, if we're going to have one at all, which is unemployment, as I mentioned, PPP, update and extension, help for states, liability protection. So that's being spoken about. The other area, of course, relates to police reform, whether we should have a federal effort to try and reduce the amount of excessive force that's sometimes being applied by certain members of law enforcement. So those are the topics that are very much front and center right now. And one more, and that is the National Defense Authorization Act, which is providing for our national defense priorities for the coming year. Those are things that are on tap right now. And there's been very little discussion about incentives for the, if you will, the entrepreneurial sector. And I just met yesterday with the Secretary of the Treasury. That was not a topic on the list. And I think you make a good point. I mean, I came up, as you know, through the private equity world and venture world, and we invested in venture and in private equity and concluded, you know what, the risk return is better in buyouts, private equity, than it is in venture. And so we were doing all sorts of buyouts, and we did fewer and fewer in the venture arena because the risk return looked better for us in buyouts. Now, back then, if we were paying more than 4 to 5 times EBITDA, we balked. We said, "Boy, that's just way too rich. 4 to 5 times EBITDA." Okay, today, I sat on the advisory committee of a private equity fund until I got elected to the Senate, and they were paying 7, 8, 9, 10 times EBITDA, and I was going like, I don't know how you guys are ever going to get out of this. Now I'm hearing numbers 12, 13 times EBITDA, and so my own view is the risk return is looking a lot better in venture than relative to buyouts than it used to. Because for buyouts at these kind of numbers, it's hard for me to see how they're going to, the LBO guys are going to get the kind of returns that their investors have been expecting if they're paying that kind of price, unless of course they've got some vision for what they're going to do to make the business better. So I think venture is looking better today. Of course, I'm old school. I have a hard time seeing SoftBank. I mean, seeing people put $100 million into a venture deal. We put with Staples, for instance, one of the first investments that we made as a venture capital firm. I mean, I think the first round was, I don't know, $2 or $3 million. And we were all holding our breath at what a big investment that was to open our first store. And now the numbers are astronomical, and that changes the risk return dynamic as well. I'm partial to, if you will, smaller initial rounds with ongoing rounds at higher valuations if the business justifies it, and the big huge investments up front strike me with fear. So what measures we might take to improve the risk return of tech investors is an open question for me. And so to you and your colleagues at Silicon Slopes, as Ross Perot used to say, I'm all ears. So if you've got some ideas as to things we could do in Washington that would make venture investing in tech more attractive, I'll be happy to pick that up and run with it.
Terrific. It actually is something that we've talked about on the Economic Impact Committee. We'd love to share some thoughts, and we appreciate you being receptive to hearing them. I think that's a good segue. You're talking about your career in business, and I would venture to say that everyone knows you founded Bain Capital, but most know you publicly as sort of Winter Olympics and onward, and you've got some tremendous experience, and you've lived through a lot in terms of crisis. The banking crisis of the 80s, you were brought back into Bain and Company in the early 90s to turn around a troubled business, which is very successful now. The dot-com bubble, the Great Recession of 2009, and of course, the Winter Olympics, and now this. When you think about the experiences that you've had of managing, being a leader through crisis, how do you think about lessons around, financial management, operational people management? What are the experiences that come to mind where, you've successfully managed through crisis and you've learned something from it?
Well, I think crisis management is a whole branch of leadership unto itself, and I have learned some lessons there. I'm not saying I'm the pro at this, but I have, in my experience as a private equity guy, we time and again would buy a business that was in trouble, and hope that we could make it better. That was the way that we were able to keep our multiples as low as they were. Is that we typically bought things that had a lot of hair on them, and we thought we could make them better. I mean, we bought a company called Vetco Gray, for instance. Vetco Gray lost $72 million the year before we bought it. We bought the equity for $1. The company came with a lot of debt, not recourse to us, but came with a lot of debt. It was owned by a public company. They didn't want to keep showing the terrible earnings impact of Vetco Gray, so we were able to get it off their books for $1. And then we took some pretty bold action. I'll tell you some of the things I think make sense. We had sort of three rules as we went into a turnaround situation. One was we did something called a strategic audit. And that has very little to do with auditing in the traditional sense. This was saying we're gonna step back from the business and be honest about every aspect of it. How qualified are our people? How good is our product? What kind of relationship do we have with our suppliers? What do our customers think of us? What are our competitors doing? It was a complete analysis, an honest assessment of where we are. And because what we typically found in a troubled situation is that people were living under an impression of where they would like things to be or where they used to be, but it sort of strayed from an honest assessment of where they were. So that was part one. So honest assessment of where you are. Rule number two was focus, which is decide what are the absolutely key things that are necessary to turn the enterprise around and focus on those and put aside everything else. Now, that's kind of the key to strategy, of course, of any kind, which is figuring out what are the most important few things that will really make a difference and focusing on those. And that's obviously that's a skill and an art to be able to do that. And the number three thing we did was build the right team to carry out that strategy, to carry out that focused approach. Oftentimes you looked and said, gosh, we got great people, but we don't have the right players for this particular challenge. And I remember when I came into the Olympics, I thought we just had a PR problem. I thought that all we needed to do was to have the government conclude that, talking about the federal government conclude that we were on the right track and get our sponsors to be happy with us again and let the people in Utah know that we were going to put on some great games. So we had kind of a PR problem. When I got there, I found out, oh no, we got not just that, but we've got a huge financial problem. We've got operating problems. I need an operator. And the job it's a bigger job than I can do alone. And so I went to one of my former partners at Bain Capital, who happened to be living in Utah and had just started his own private equity firm, asked him to walk away from his private equity firm for a couple of years and be my partner and be the operating head. And so we were able to take the job and divide it into two. And then we said we'd also need a CFO, and we brought in a great CFO who now is the CFO for Bob Garf. And so this was the approach that we took to that setting. So build the right team. Now I'll mention one more thing that I think is critical in this setting. And that's as I'm watching what's happening in Washington. As I think about what you do as the leader in a setting like that, there is a way of approaching the people that you're dealing with, the market, your banks, your employees, your customers, your suppliers. And basically, I'll joke here, jokingly, it's look at what the White House is doing with regards to COVID-19 and do the opposite, right? What I mean by that is, if there's a problem, take responsibility. If something went wrong, if you did something wrong in the past, don't look for someone else to blame. Take responsibility. Because that says to all the people that rely on you, okay, this is a guy that sees the problem and he's going to try and get it fixed. He's taking responsibility. He's not blaming someone else, because if he blames someone else, then that means it's out of his control as to whether or not it gets fixed, because that means someone else has to fix it. So always take responsibility. Number two, tell people absolutely as straight as you got it. Maintain credibility no matter what. If you think it could get bad, you don't know what it's going to be, tell people, we don't know what it's going to be. We just don't know. We're sorry, don't have the answer to that. But we're going to tell you as soon as we know what's happening, we'll let you know. Make sure that you don't lose credibility. I learned with a founder of Staples that we went to the market to go public. He laid out all the risks He laid out what he thought we would do quarter by quarter. They were never surprised, and our stock price skyrocketed, in part because of the credibility that he had as a spokesperson. So that'd be my fourth rule,
Yeah.
which is as a person leading in a crisis setting, maintain your credibility with all the stakeholders and take responsibility.
Look, I really appreciate the perspective of someone who has lived through that in business, and there's clearly something from your business career that you're bringing to the political world. As you talk about leadership in crisis, one of the frustrations that I've heard from citizens and from business owners is that the strategy of how to combat COVID is unclear. And one day it's we're going to lock down. We've listened a lot to Dr. Fauci, and then the next day we hear maybe we're coming together for Easter and we're back out spending money. And what should this look like? I mean, where should this strategy come from? Federal versus state. How should we be thinking about where we take direction in Utah as we're thinking about planning our businesses?
Well, I can tell you it's been a mishmash and not terribly well managed. As we all know, part of that was a function of the reality that we didn't know what COVID-19 was or how it would affect us or how it was spread. For a while there, people thought it was, we'd get it by touching a doorknob or an elevator button so we just didn't know anything about the disease. Now that we've learned more about it, I think we can be much more skilled and strategic in thinking about how to respond to it without damaging the economy. And I'm not a virologist, so I'm not gonna try and describe that. But we have learned that younger people don't have the same mortality rate clearly as older people. That older people are at great risk. Younger people don't seem to have a greater risk than they do from a normal flu. Well, that suggests that when we think about isolation, we really want to let older people and those that are immunocompromised be more isolated. At the same time, I remember right off the beginning, they told us, hey, you know what? Wearing a mask is not going to protect you from COVID-19 because, the germs can get around that mask. And I saw a graphic today that showed that if you're wearing a mask and someone who has COVID-19, perhaps asymptomatic, is talking to you, that the likelihood you will be exposed and get the disease is 75%, even if you're wearing a mask. Mm. But then they went on to show that if the person who is infected is wearing a mask and you're not wearing a mask, but the infected person is wearing a mask, the risk of infection goes down to 5%. Mm. So wearing a mask dramatically impacts the spread of COVID-19. And they didn't know that at the beginning. We do now. And so, were I running a business or an airline or a municipality, I'd be saying, hey guys, you got to be wearing masks. If you're going into a business, put a mask on. It's not going to protect you if someone is infected and they cough in your face. But if everybody's wearing a mask, we're not going to be spreading this disease. So, we just haven't been as effective as we should have been. The federal government, in my opinion, should have taken responsibility for personal protective equipment, for masks, for gowns, and so forth. And it didn't. The federal government said, hey, all the states, you go off and get whatever you need. Well, that created a competition between states, mismanagement, oversupply in some places, undersupply in others. Same things with regards to testing. That was not organized and coordinated at the federal level. It just wasn't put together in the way it should have been. I understand how that happened with the first crisis of this nature, but we sure should learn some lessons from it because this is probably going to happen again.
One of the things that we started to hear early on from small business owners in Utah is that this burden of stress was creating some real sort of mental health issues. And this is a conversation that we have been having in society long before COVID-19 hit, but I think it's created an additional layer of focus, as this has just been a tremendous burden for so many people.
Oh, yeah.
I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on, as business leaders or members of teams, how can we be helpful? How should we think about our role? And then in terms of, what state, what federal, local government can do, how can we start to address this and really normalize this conversation so that it's one that we're actually making progress on?
Well, that comes back to sort of lessons of leadership, if you will. What do leaders do? And the people on this streaming event tonight are leaders in their homes, at least, perhaps in their faith, in their schools, but particularly in their businesses. And what leaders do has an enormous impact on others. And let me just describe some of the things I've seen in other leaders, and it's shaped my view about what's important in leadership. So one, I was named after someone named J. Willard Marriott, the founder of Marriott Corporation. My first name is Willard, after J. Willard Marriott. He was my dad's best friend. And one of the unusual characteristics of Bill Marriott, and now his son, Bill Jr., who, by the way, is in his 80s. So we got some, this goes back a ways, was that both of these guys care very deeply about the people who work for them. And they care very deeply about their customers, not just because they can make money off their employees and make money from their customers, but because they have a genuine affection for and concern for other people. And I have found the most successful leaders that I've interacted with are people who, like Bill Marriott, have a genuine concern for the people they work with and for their customers. And they're able to communicate that, not through techniques, but through real personal interaction. I mean, I've been with Bill Marriott, now the chairman emeritus of the company, as he goes into a hotel, and people there love him. He shakes their hands. He goes to the back room. He goes into the kitchen. He goes into the laundry. He meets people. He asks them about their life, how long they've been with the company. He shows genuine interest. And the funny thing is that when you do customer surveys about what is distinctive about a Marriott hotel property, they talk about the employees showing concern for their guests. And I'm convinced that the personal concern of Bill Marriott himself has been passed on to his employees. And by the way, there are only 170,000 people worldwide who wear a Marriott badge. And it's just extraordinary what one leader can do. So that's part one. Another aspect of leadership. I met a guy named Jim Leotow. Jim told me that he graduated second in his high school class, second from the bottom. His future, he said, did not include college. His dad was a successful businessman. He went to his dad and he said, "Dad, would you loan me $10,000? Because I want to start a little restaurant. And at the end of a year, if I can pay it back plus interest, well, keep pursuing that career. If I can't pay it back, I'll agree with you, Dad, and I'll enlist in the military." Dad loaned him the money, and he put together this little restaurant. He found out that $10,000 doesn't go very far in starting a restaurant. So he bought a couple of stainless steel tables, started making sandwiches and delivering them in a college town in central Illinois. Now, Jim is better known as Jimmy John. And Jimmy John has about 1,500 restaurants today across the country. And the most remarkable dimension of Jimmy John is his extraordinary positive nature. He is the happiest, most friendly, positive guy imaginable. I remember I was invited to go on someone's yacht one day in the Bahamas, I think it was. And they pulled into a yacht slip, and there was a yacht next to us about 200 feet long. And I looked on the front of this yacht, and it was Jimmy John. I said, "Jimmy John, how are you?" And he looked up and said, "Hey, Mitt, how are you doing? What are you doing on that boat?" I said, "Oh, it's a friend's." I said, "Jimmy John, is that your boat?" He said, "Oh, yeah, this is my boat." I said, "Did sandwiches pay for that boat?" He said, "Oh, no. extra cheese paid for this boat. You know, and I mean, the guy, he was just always, it is always full of humor and smiles. People like to be around positive people. People like to buy things from positive people. They like to work for positive people. They like to talk with positive people. They like to talk with people who have a sense of humor. So great leaders care about others, and great leaders are positive. If they're down in the dumps, if they're showing their fear at all times, no one wants to be around them. I'll mention just one more thing. And this is just, maybe it's a personal thing for me, but I was always drawn to entrepreneurs and executives who loved data, who wanted to get the facts, who didn't make decisions based on their gut feel, and they may well have a gut feel about what's important, what's not, but they got the data. They did the hard work of doing the analysis and collecting the information and making decisions based upon their, if you will, subjective sense, but also based upon the data. And where we went wrong on investments from time to time is when we fell in love with an idea and didn't really do the analysis and gather the data. So another dimension of leadership, in my opinion, is requiring the hard work to collect the data and make decisions based on good, cold, hard data. So 3 things for me. I mean, if you're talking about leading a company, leading a state, leading a university, leading a family, caring about people, genuinely caring about people. Number 2, being positive and optimistic and happy and funny. And then number 3, making decisions based on cold, hard facts and taking responsibility for those decisions. So, Jeremy, there's a couple of thoughts anyway.
It's great advice. Thank you for sharing that. Let's pivot the conversation a little bit. This has been it's been a tense period over the last month or so from a race relations perspective. You know, just as we thought that we were developing a little bit of confidence in where we were in the COVID-19 journey, we stacked on something else that has felt heavy. It's felt tense. You know, I guess to some extent, it's always been there. And we can view this as an opportunity that sort of forced this discussion to the forefront of our conversation where we can make progress. Nonetheless, it's it's a conversation that we're having in a way that I've never experienced in my lifetime. You know, one of the there was a quote of yours in the Salt Lake Tribune a week or so ago that I really liked, and it was very simple. It's country over party. And you know, some would say, well, that's not the system. There's a 2-party system. And but you were the only Republican who marched alongside Black Lives Matter. And you know, your father, I've heard you reference your father as someone who gave you courage, who had courage to stand against racism. You know, really was a strong proponent of, was a champion of civil rights in an era where that was it was an unpopular stance to take. This is something that we as business leaders in our teams we're talking a lot about. And you know, I'd love to hear your perspective on. A lot of us believe that we really can't stay silent on this issue, and yet it's an issue that's controversial. There's a lot of energy behind it. How should we think about balancing sort of a pure shareholder business interest with sort of this obligation to take a stand on something like this that we believe in?
Well, my own view is that you have to go with the feelings of your own heart. I mean, the reality is that for many people of color in our country, they have different feelings about the police than white folks do. And there's a certain degree of fear that they feel if they see an officer that white folks don't feel. And I mean, you remember the story in the Starbucks where the manager of a Starbucks asked 3 African Americans to leave because and there's no question, had they been 3 white guys with ties, that would have never crossed their mind. But because they were black guys that were not wearing ties, they felt threatened. And my own view is that it's just wrong to have people who are children of the same God and citizens of the same country who feel that they may be at some kind of risk by virtue of their ethnicity. That's just wrong. And so, people say, well, gosh, all lives matter. Why, Mitt, are you saying Black lives matter? Well, I mean, if someone came up to me or I came up to someone, let's say, I come up to someone and say, hey, help me get Peter to the hospital. He's been hurt. And they say, well, all lives matter. I'd say, yeah, of course, but Peter's the one that's hurt. All right. Of course, everybody matters, but Peter's hurting right now. And right now, African Americans and people of color are hurting. And that's why Black Lives Matter says, hey, I recognize that particularly in the arena of law enforcement, that in some cases, not all by any means, but in some cases, certain either policies or certain individuals are likely to come down harder on people of color than they would a person that's not of color. And that's just simply wrong. So it's a pretty simple statement, in my opinion, to say, hey, everybody should be treated the same. And people pull out different facts and figures about, who is more likely to commit a crime. It's like, that's not the reality. I mean, I've got an African-American grandson. He shouldn't feel any differently when he sees a police officer than my other kids. And if he does, I'm failing him as a grandfather. So for me, speaking out and saying this is something we got to deal with is as natural as can be. I can't tell you about what businesses ought to do, but I can tell you what I do as an individual. And I would presume that that's true for you as an individual as well, that you do what you feel is right as an individual. And if you happen to be the leader of a business, well, that's going to communicate to your employees where you stand, which I think is totally appropriate.
Do you think about legislative steps to address this issue, or how do you think about the role of Congress or legislation in the fight against racism, and what can we do as citizens in Utah to support that process?
Well, I think, first of all, I think showing that people in Utah care about this topic and that we stand with people of color and that we're concerned about their concern, that's the most important thing you can do. The old, the mansplaining that women sometimes joke about, which is that men always come in and try and solve everything. And women would say, I just want you to listen to what I'm dealing with. You don't have to solve all the problems, just listen. All right. So sometimes just listening is a good start. So communicating that we listen and that we care is a great start. Then okay, what can we do legislatively? By the way, I skipped over what can businesses do. And I think businesses can say, we're going to be really careful in making sure that we make an extra effort to recruit in places where there are minorities that we can hire. We don't just go to places that are all white students coming out. We go to places that have more diversity, and we try and provide a more diverse workplace. Those are things that businesses can do. But what can government do? With regards to law enforcement is really guided at the state and local level, not at the federal level. We don't have a federal police force. We do have the FBI, IRS agents, park rangers, and so forth. But the law enforcement that we're talking about and the scenes that have been so horrific have been local law enforcement and state law enforcement. And so localities and states are the places where most legislation is going to occur that changes the dynamic. And that means, in your town or your city, if you're from Orem, you show up at a meeting of the city council and say, hey, what are we doing here to make sure we've got the kinds of rules? Are we going to have chokeholds allowed here? when do officers feel that it's appropriate to get training and to get the kinds of skills they may need to de-escalate. I mean, these are the kinds of things happening at the local and state level. At the federal level, there are some things we can do. We can provide funding to states and localities that are doing additional training. We can provide funding for more body cameras. We can also make sure that instances of violence, either death or serious injury, are reported at the federal level, so we can look at patterns and understand where problems lie. These are the kinds of things we can do at the federal level. Our legislation did that. One thing the Democrats want to do that Republicans are saying no to, they want to remove something called qualified immunity. Right now, if a law enforcement officer, let's say, abridges your constitutional right to gather, let's say you've got a party and it's noisy, and the police come in, they say, we're breaking this thing up. All right, I'm sorry, you guys are all going home. Get out of here, go home. Well, someone can say, well, you've abridged my civil right, my right to assemble. All right, and so I'm going to sue that law enforcement officer for violating my civil right. Well, right now, under the law created by the courts, the law enforcement officer is not going to get sued for that. He or she is not going to have to pay, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the city's not going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars because they've abridged someone's civil rights, unless it's willful or wanton or it's done with malice. If it's a negligent setting, why that's not going to cause a liability. And the Democrats want to change that. They want to say the trial lawyers ought to be able to go after law enforcement personnel. And people like me are saying, no way. Our police are going to spend every day in court fighting one lawsuit after the other. That just makes no sense at all. So that's kind of a bone of contention. That could be handled at the federal level. I think it would be a mistake to open the door to all sorts of lawsuits against police. I've spoken with leaders of our law enforcement community in Utah. They say if we were to put a provision like that in place, we'd lose 2/3 of our law enforcement officers. They'd say, no way, who needs this? I don't want to spend my life in a courtroom. So that's a place where we disagree, but there are a lot of places we do agree. And I think the state and our cities and towns are going to do a good job in finally attacking this issue.
Let me, I'd love to wrap up with a couple of questions that are a little bit more personal in nature. You've operated at a fast pace your entire life. You've accomplished a lot. You're a senator. You don't slow down. What drives you?
Well, that's a good question. I don't find sitting around to be very enjoyable. I want to be building something and making a difference. I'm in an unusual position in that, given the education and the love I had in my home from my parents, and the example of my mom and dad in their passion for things they cared about, I have this sense of obligation, this duty gene, if you will, to try and make things better where I can. And I didn't think I was going to run for Senate. My goodness, this was not on my list of things to do. But frankly, I looked at what was happening in Washington, and I was of the conviction that we needed more people of stability and judgment in Washington, and my experience would be helpful at a critical time. We got to even have constitutional crises I might be necessary for. So I felt an obligation to jump in again. And this won't go on forever, but that's what drives me. And there's no question but that my faith has associated with it a sense of purpose and obligation to make a difference. And that's one of the things that's part of my makeup.
You and Ann raised really great sons. They're remarkable people. You have a lot of grandchildren. How do you think about your role as a grandfather? What do you hope that they, what do you hope they remember you for? What influence do you want to have on your grandchildren?
The sad truth, I shouldn't say this, but I'll blurt out the truth. The sad truth is that grandparents have very little impact. I mean, directly on their grandkids, but they have enormous impact on their own children, and their own children have enormous impact on their kids. And so if you've messed up your own kids, good luck trying to solve the problems of your grandkids. But if your own kids are doing okay, your grandkids will do okay. And there's no question. Ann and I sat down and wrote a letter to our grandkids and to our distant descendants, saying these are some of our lessons from our life. Everything from our jobs, careers, marriage, love, dating, drugs, pornography. We write about all these things for our grandkids to read. I hope we wrote it in a book published by Deseret Books. So go out and buy it. It costs like $5, maybe $1 these days. And so we're trying to teach lessons to our grandkids. We show them that we love each other. Ann and I love each other. That's probably the most important thing we can do. But frankly, Jeremy, our job with our grandkids was pretty well cooked when our sons got married, and they and their wives are making all the difference in the world in our grandkids' lives.
Thank you. Thank you for your great example, not only as a business leader, political leader, but as a husband and father. Certainly an important role model for us. Hey, Senator Romney, thank you so much. What a great conversation. Thank you for all you do to represent Utah. You fight the good fight. Thanks for representing our country so well. And thanks for a great conversation this hour. We truly appreciate it.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good to be with you, and the best to all the folks that are part of this streaming tonight. And good luck to all of the businesses in Utah, small and large. Keep employing people. We're counting on it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. With that, we will wrap up. I would remind you next Tuesday, we will have a town hall on PPP forgiveness. There are finally there's new understanding on forgiveness that's highly relevant here in Utah. Join us Tuesday at 5 p.m. We look forward to another great conversation with you. All the best.